Human beings accidentally change Jesus' message. The strange part is that this may have started before Christianity even existed. Most people imagine the story beginning centuries later, with a powerful church, religious authorities, political influence, councils deciding doctrine, and translations changing meanings. That is where many assume the original message drifted away from its source. But there is a problem. By the time institutions became powerful enough to shape Christianity on a large scale, the message had already traveled across entire regions. It had crossed cultures, languages, and generations. Millions of words had already been spoken, and thousands of conversations had already happened. If the transformation began somewhere, it likely began much earlier. So perhaps the answer is translation. That feels reasonable. Jesus taught within a specific historical world. His words moved into Greek, Latin, and eventually hundreds of other languages. Anyone who speaks multiple languages understands that meaning never travels perfectly. Some ideas shrink, some ideas expand, and some ideas survive only approximately. Yet translation creates another puzzle. Translation happens after people already know the message. Before words can be translated, they must first be heard, remembered, repeated, and explained. Something happened before the first translation ever existed, and that leads to a far stranger possibility: memory. Modern psychology has uncovered something uncomfortable about memory. We often imagine it as storage, like a recording waiting to be replayed, but memory behaves more like reconstruction. People rebuild experiences rather than retrieve them. The same event can create different memories inside different minds, not because people are dishonest, but because attention is selective, meaning is personal, and memory is active. And Jesus left behind no personal manuscript. The earliest version of his message did not exist as a document. It existed inside people. Inside a listener repeating a story, a friend explaining a teaching, a parent sharing a memory, and a traveler carrying an idea to a different town. For a moment, it seems the mystery is solved. Human beings change the message because memory is imperfect. Except that explanation creates an even bigger problem. Imperfect memory should destroy ideas. History is filled with forgotten teachers, lost movements, and messages that vanished completely. If memory were only a source of distortion, Jesus' teachings should have disappeared alongside countless others. Yet they survived, not merely for a few decades, but across centuries. History offers countless examples of ideas that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. Ancient philosophers attracted students, influenced their communities, and then slowly faded from collective memory. Charismatic teachers gathered followers, inspired movements, and ultimately left behind very little. Entire religions once filled temples, shaped governments, and guided the daily lives of millions. Yet today, many survive only through fragments preserved in the archaeological record, inscriptions carved into stone, broken statues buried beneath the earth, or names briefly mentioned in ancient texts that most people will never encounter. This is not necessarily because those ideas were weaker, or because those teachers were less compelling. Survival simply follows strange rules. An idea can be true and still disappear. It can be meaningful and still vanish. It can profoundly change individual lives and yet fail to travel across the centuries. That is what makes Jesus' message unusual. The question is not simply why people remembered it, because people remember many things. The deeper question is why enough people continued remembering it long after the original witnesses were gone. How did a message survive the deaths of its first listeners, political collapse, changing languages, and entirely different civilizations? Because the further an idea travels through time, the less it depends on its creator. Eventually, its survival depends on the people willing to carry it forward. And that changes the story completely. Survival is much harder than most people realize. An idea cannot simply remain frozen and expect to live forever. Every generation speaks differently. Every generation asks different questions and inherits different fears. Imagine preserving a message perfectly. Every phrase remains untouched. Every explanation remains forbidden. Every interpretation remains locked in its original form. At first, that sounds ideal. Then time passes. The language changes. The culture changes. The world changes. The message remains exactly the same, and fewer people understand it. Eventually, it survives only as a historical artifact, protected perfectly and disconnected completely. Now imagine the opposite. Each generation tries to make the message understandable again. Old examples are replaced with new ones. Ancient images are connected to modern problems. Questions receive new answers and explanations become more accessible. The message stays alive, but it never stays perfectly still. And that is where the entire story turns upside down. Most people assume preservation and change are opposites. What if they are actually part of the same process? The very act of keeping an idea alive may require transforming it. The first listener already interprets. The first retelling already selects. The first explanation already alters emphasis. A question is asked and an answer is given. A detail becomes important while another becomes secondary. The message begins moving, not centuries later, immediately. And suddenly the search for a single moment of corruption starts to look misguided. Maybe there was no single moment, no villain, no dramatic fracture. Maybe the transformation happened through something far more ordinary: participation. One person sharing an idea with another. One generation handing a message to the next. One community trying to make meaning out of inherited words. Because once a message reaches enough people, adaptation becomes unavoidable. The larger the audience becomes, the more worlds it must enter. The more worlds it enters, the more interpretation becomes necessary. The more interpretation becomes necessary, the more variation appears. And that leads to a possibility far stranger than the usual story. Jesus' message may not have changed because it failed to spread accurately. Jesus' message may have changed because it spread successfully. The very process people often blame for altering the message may have been the same process that saved it from disappearing. Without adaptation, perhaps it would have remained unchanged and forgotten. Without interpretation, perhaps it would have remained pure and silent. Which means the deepest irony may be this: the fingerprints left behind by generations of believers were not evidence that the message survived badly. They may be evidence that it survived at all. For centuries, people have searched for the moment the original message was lost. But what if there was never a single moment to find? What if the transformation began with the first listener, continued with every storyteller, and expanded with every generation that refused to let the message die? Because if every idea must adapt in order to survive, then perhaps history is not a record of messages preserved. Perhaps history is a record of messages surviving. And those are not the same thing. Because ideas that remain unchanged sometimes disappear with time. Ideas that live on, however, leave traces in every generation they touch.